He took our security for efficiency, but he forgot one thing. We are not a server farm. We are a company. So, when the simmering rage finally boiled over, I decided to give Aegis the ultimate digital reckoning. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, just like my patience. And maybe a little bit of my hope. It was Tuesday, which meant the grind was firmly in gear. The spreadsheets were blurring into one giant, meaningless beige landscape. And my afternoon meeting was scheduled to discuss synergistic growth opportunities with Mark from IT. Mark. Bless his well-meaning, overly polished soul. He was the architect of my current, simmering rage. For years, my company, Stellar Dynamics, had managed its own digital fortress. We had the in-house security team. The late nights fueled by pizza and existential dread. The proprietary firewalls patched by people who actually knew the guts of the system. Not just the user interface. We were good. We were resilient. We were, frankly, tired, but we were ours. Then came the executive mandate: leaner, faster, outsource. Mark, with his tailored blazer and his PowerPoint animations that felt like aggressive jazz hands, presented the proposal. He spoke of scalability, of global redundancy, of shifting the operational burden to a firm called Aegis Solutions. Aegis, a name that sounded both shiny and vaguely predatory. They promised a complete lift-and shift of our entire cybersecurity infrastructure. They'd handle the monitoring, the patching, the threat hunting. The whole damn digital immune system. I, being the chief operations officer, was the necessary, slightly bewildered signatory. I trusted Mark. I trusted Aegis. I trusted the promise of less late-night fire drills and more time to actually innovate. Or at least pretend to. The transition was a controlled demolition. Phase 1 was the data migration. Phase 2 was the firewall swap. Phase 3, the grand finale, was the handover of the keys to the kingdom. Mark oversaw it with the triumphant air of a man who just successfully convinced a skeptical board that beige was actually a sophisticated shade of off-white. The first few weeks were glorious. The alerts were managed, not screamed. The vulnerability scans came back cleaner. The team was freed up to focus on product development instead of chasing phishing emails from Nigerian princes. I felt a genuine surge of relief, a warm, sweet feeling that was almost dangerous. It felt like I'd finally outsourced my anxiety. But the honeymoon phase, as they always do, was temporary. It started subtly. A tiny lag in the network response time that felt like a digital sigh. A patch update that seemed to install itself 3 days late, causing a minor hiccup in the inventory database. Then, the little things piled up. A routine penetration test, when it finally happened, flagged a series of permissions inconsistencies that shouldn't have existed if the migration was clean. When I brought these up in the weekly review, Mark deflected with practiced ease. That's just the integration lag, Sierra. Aegis is still optimizing their protocols on our backend. Give it a quarter and it'll be seamless. A quarter. Another 3 months of this lukewarm, slightly irritating performance. The cracks began to show, not just in the minor glitches, but in the nature of the security. Our old system, even with its quirks, had been built around our business logic. It knew that the manufacturing floor needed high-priority access to the ERP system. But the marketing interns could only poke at the social media metrics. Aegis, bless their outsourced efficiency, seemed to have optimized for generalized corporate security. They were applying blanket rules. They were prioritizing efficiency over nuance. One afternoon, a high-level executive, our VP of sales, a woman whose tantrums could power a small town, found that her access to the client database was intermittently failing, forcing her to call IT, who would then have to wait for the Aegis NOC Network Operations Center response time, which was, predictably, slower than a sloth on vacation. "This is unacceptable," she boomed, her voice echoing through the open-plan office. "We are paying premium rates for a system that performs like a dial-up modem, in a blizzard." Mark, looking genuinely pained, tried to placate her. "We are working on it, Carol. Aegis is performing deep diagnostics." Deep diagnostics," Carol scoffed. "I need deep functionality. I need the data. I need to close this deal before the end of the fiscal period. Not wait for some offshore analyst to finish their lunch break." That was the tipping point. It wasn't the lag or the failed patch. It was the sheer, arrogant dismissal of our needs. They hadn't just taken over our security, they had absorbed our operational rhythm. And they were treating it like a low-priority background process on their own overworked servers. They were optimizing for their quarterly metrics, not ours. The injustice settled in my stomach like a cold, heavy stone. They took our self-sufficiency, our hard-earned expertise, and replaced it with a shiny, outsourced veneer that was fundamentally brittle. I started digging, quietly, while Mark and the rest of the team were focused on generating positive PR about our robust new infrastructure. I was tracing the connections. I started with the access logs for the primary security orchestration layer, the thing that told all the other security tools what to do. I needed to see where the control truly resided. Aegis had provided us with a dashboard, a beautiful, intuitive pane of glass through which we could watch the digital world breathe. But a dashboard is just a display. The real control mechanism, the master API hooks, the root administrator credentials, those were theirs. I spent 2 nights in the server room, the hum of the cooling units sounding like a collective, judgmental sigh. I cross-referenced the firewall logs with the IAM's identity and access management logs. I found the choke points. Aegis wasn't just monitoring, they were subtly throttling. They were applying rate limits to our most critical outbound data streams. Not because of a threat, but because, according to their internal documentation, overutilization during peak marketing cycles poses an unnecessary load risk to the shared tenancy. They were deliberately slowing us down. They were micromanaging our velocity. The rage, which had been a low, throbbing hum, suddenly spiked into a white-hot scream. They hadn't just taken our security, they had taken our momentum. They had weaponized optimization against us. If they thought they could simply absorb Stellar Dynamics' digital heart, treat it like a leased asset, and charge us a premium for the privilege, they were gravely mistaken. They had given me the blueprint for the entire system, and more importantly, they had given me the back door. The one they thought was too subtle for the busy COO to notice. My plan solidified during a particularly frustrating morning when Mark cheerfully informed me that the ERP integration was experiencing an unforeseen latency due to a complex cross-platform authentication handshake. No, Mark. It wasn't latency. It was malice. The ultimate digital blackout. It couldn't be a simple DDoS attack that was noisy, predictable, and would trigger an immediate Aegis alert. It had to be surgical. It had to be systemic. It had to be an internal collapse that looked like a catastrophic failure of their integration, forcing them to scramble, to sweat, to admit defeat. The target was the perimeter firewall that was too easy to defend. The target was the trust relationship itself. The connection between our internal authentication servers and the Aegis-managed policy engine. I started small. A series of carefully timed, low-volume requests mimicking legitimate user activity, but slightly out of sequence. A ping to the inventory server followed by a login attempt to the CRM, but delayed by exactly 1-2 seconds. A period that Aegis's automated anomaly detection would flag as a slight degradation, likely network jitter. Then I introduced the noise. Not malicious noise, but operational noise. A rapid succession of legitimate but high-demand queries from non-critical services. The HR portal running payroll checks while the R&D server was pulling massive design files. The Aegis system, designed to manage load efficiently, began to react by applying escalating throttling. This was the setup. The slow, agonizing tightening of the digital noose. The escalation reached its peak that Wednesday afternoon. I watched the dashboard, heart hammering against my ribs. Watching the green stability bars start to flicker amber, then a sickly yellow. The latency shot up from a comfortable 20 ms to a grinding 150 ms. Mark was already sweating through his blazer, frantically tapping at his keyboard. Sierra, the API response times are climbing. Aegis is flagging a potential overload on the policy layer. They're suggesting a temporary resource allocation increase. Let them suggest it, I said. My voice unnervingly calm. We'll see how fast they can approve it. Then I hit the sequence. The final sequence wasn't a brute force attack. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of digital disobedience. First I used a dormant, seldom used service account. One Aegis hadn't bothered to thoroughly scrub during the migration to request a complete recursive audit log dump from the primary network switch. This was huge, a massive, sudden data pull. Second, while the system was busy prioritizing the audit, I injected a series of corrupted metadata packets into the authentication handshake stream. These packets were designed not to break the connection, but to force the Aegis engine to spend excessive cycles attempting to validate them, like trying to read a manuscript written in shifting sand. Third, and this was the killer blow, I commanded the inventory management system, which was currently in the middle of a massive database write operation, to simultaneously request a permission update for a high-privilege user, VP Carol, naturally, while simultaneously forcing a rollback on the previous 2 successful updates. The result was instantaneous, breathtaking, and utterly beautiful in its destructive elegance. The dashboard didn't just turn red, it turned a violent, pulsating crimson. The smooth, steady hum of the system didn't lag, it hitched, stuttered, and then went silent. The screens flickered. The amber warnings flashed into strobe light panic. Mark stared at the monitor, his face draining of all color. The carefully constructed facade of calm shattering like cheap glass. What did you do?" he whispered, sounding genuinely terrified for the first time in 3 years. "I reminded them who built the house," I replied, leaning forward, finally allowing the sheer weight of the injustice to lift from my chest and settle into triumphant fury. The system didn't just slow down, it choked. The entire internal network, the digital bloodstream of stellar dynamics, seized up. The ERP system froze mid-calculation. The sales pipeline stalled at the point of the final contract sign-off. The marketing automation platform, which was supposed to be generating thousands of leads per hour, choked on a single, corrupted validation token. It was the ultimate digital blackout, and it wasn't a brute force attack. It was a perfectly executed, nuanced digital heart attack, administered by the very systems Aegis had so arrogantly deemed optimized. The calls started flooding in. Not the polite inquiries about latency, but the panicked, guttural demands from Carol. From the CEO's office, from the R&D floor. "Sierra, what is the status? The client database is unresponsive. We are blind. The manufacturing line is idling. We are losing time." Mark finally found his voice, a high-pitched squeak of desperation. He frantically started barking commands at the console, trying to force a manual override, trying to bypass the policy engine that was now in a state of recursive validation hell. The Aegis portal. It's locked. The manual failover is cycling through diagnostics, but it keeps hitting the authentication conflict. That was the moment the revenge crystallized. Aegis hadn't just taken our system, they had taken our agency. And now, trapped inside their beautiful, efficient cage, They were paralyzed, waiting for their own over-engineered protocols to choke them. I didn't rush to fix it, not yet. Fixing it would be admitting their superiority. First, I wanted them to understand the depth of their blunder. I watched the amber warnings turn solid, burning red across the main operational map. The entire company was holding its breath, suspended in digital amber, waiting for the digital defibrillator to kick in. Then, I brought up a small, isolated terminal window on my secondary monitor. A terminal that ran outside the direct control loop of the primary Aegis dashboard. A small, dusty patch of ground within their highly manicured digital garden. I typed a single command, the command that summarized every missed deadline, every ignored warning, every condescending explanation of optimization. Override force execute. Restore primary logic stack v4. One original stellar build, it was the ultimate insult. It was the declaration that their sophisticated, externally managed wisdom was flawed. We were rolling back to our code. We were reverting to the reliable, slightly clunky, but deeply understood machinery that we had built ourselves. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The red light pulsed, mocking us. Then, a wave of activity washed over the system. Not the hesitant, stuttering flow of a recovery, but a sudden, powerful rush, like a dam breaking. The flickering stopped. The crimson bled back into a deep, reassuring, robust red. The latency dropped instantly from 115 ms back to a crisp, professional 18 ms. The API calls snapped back into place with decisive authority. The entire system sighed, a collective digital exhale of relief. On the dashboard, the Aegis policy engine didn't just stop cycling. It seemed to snap back into compliance, recognizing the master command. The little indicator lights, which had been flashing with frantic uncertainty, settled into a steady, confident green. Mark stood frozen, staring at the screen, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man who had just watched his life's work be politely, yet devastatingly, disassembled by an invisible hand. The flow of data resumed. The sales team instantly regained access to the client list. The VP of sales letting out a noise that was somewhere between a shriek and a roar of vindication. The manufacturing line whirred back to life, the familiar, reassuring clang of production filling the air. I leaned back in my chair. The cold coffee suddenly feeling like the perfect companion. Mark finally managed to move. He didn't look triumphant, he looked hollowed out. He looked like a curator whose masterpiece had been stolen, only to be returned with a note saying, "It's fine. But we fixed the humidity control on the back wall, just in case." "Sarah," he managed, his voice raspy, that was incredible. How did you know that sequence, that override code?" I picked up my mug, finally taking a deep, hot sip of the revived brew. The flavor was sharp, bitter, and utterly satisfying. "Because, Mark," I said, meeting his gaze, letting the quiet confidence in my tone do the heavy lifting. "You outsourced the infrastructure, but you forgot to outsource the soul of it. You gave them the hardware and the monitoring, but you left the core logic, the DNA, with us." I paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. "And when they started trying to optimize away our soul," I concluded, a genuine, predatory smile finally stretching my face, "we simply reminded them who was in charge of the maintenance schedule, the digital." Blackout hadn't been a failure of Aegis. It had been a demonstration of their fundamental, glorious, and utterly predictable hubris. And I, the coup, had just taken the keys back. One perfectly executed line of code at a time.